what's up? So I finally set up my Bioactive corn snake enclosure, and in today's video I'm going to go over everything and show you guys how I did it. Side note, I am in a different room today because I have workers working on my building today, and they're basically ripping off the entire side paneling of the house and putting new paneling on, so they're just banging incessantly on the building. And the reptile room is the main area where the banging is happening, so it's very, very loud over there. So I'm filming in the living room, and if you still hear banging, I apologize because there's absolutely nothing I can do about it, and hopefully they'll be finished in a couple of days, but for now, this is what it is. So I'm just gonna get right into it and let you guys know how I set up this enclosure for Bloom, my corn snake. So in my previous video, I showed you guys everything from my unboxing video from Josh's Frogs. They sent me everything that I needed to build this enclosure. The only thing that they didn't send me was the tank, which I actually found off of Craigslist for really cheap. So it was just a 30-gallon enclosure. So I snagged that and decided it would be perfect for Bloom. And then Josh's Frogs sent me everything that I could possibly need to set up this Bioactive enclosure. So again, if you want to check out Josh's Frogs, I will put their information in my description and you can check them out, and anything that you order on their website, you can use my discount code Reptilian Garden at the checkout and save yourself 15% off of your order. So the very first thing that I needed to do when building this enclosure was to do the background. And to do the background, I needed a safe silicone that's safe for animals, and I also needed the Josh's Frogs biobedding substrate that was going to be used for the background as well. And they also sent me the foam that I would need in order to do the backdrop as well. So with all of those items, I was able to start building the enclosure. The very first thing that I had to do when setting up the backdrop of the enclosure was I actually had some pieces of wood that I wanted to use. So I placed them where I wanted them to be on the enclosure on the back. And then after that, it was time to start applying the foam in order to keep those pieces in place and be able to make the naturalistic background that I wanted. So I applied all of the foam and I put it around the pieces of wood that I wanted to have held in place, and then I filled in the rest of the space with the foam, and then I had to wait 24 hours for that to completely dry in order to move on to the next step. So the next day, after the foam had dried and it was a very solid form, then it was time to carve it down because the foam expands significantly. So the foam was very thick at that point, and it was just time to carve it down to make it look exactly how I wanted it to be. I also like to smooth it out just to make it a little bit easier when applying the silicone. So I just used a butter knife and carved away at the foam until I had it the way that I wanted it to be. And then the next step after that was just applying the silicone. So I messed up with the silicone. I've done this before too. I'm completely new to silicone, and I have issues with it. And I didn't use I don't even know what it's called. There's something you put on the end of the silicone to like push it out. I didn't do that. So again, I popped the back end off of the silicone. So I literally had to just like shove my hand into the silicone and then apply it with my gloves onto the backdrop. That's normally not what any individual would do in applying silicone, but I'm me and I'm just like challenged with this stuff. So silicone is not my friend. So I kind of messed that up, but I mean, I was still able to apply it. It was just done in the most annoying way possible because it was just very messy for me. But I was still able to do it anyway, so they gave me a black silicone, which was great. I really liked it. So I just spread that all around the foam, and then after I would put the silicone on, I would place the Josh's Frogs bio bedding on top of that and push down to make sure that it would stick in place. So after doing that to the backdrop, I checked to make sure that there weren't any pieces I was missing. So I just made sure that everything was just completely filled in with dirt. And then I had to wait another 24 hours to let that dry completely. And then the next day it was completely ready. Everything was dry. It was looking great. I did also add 2 little plants into the foam when I was applying in the beginning. That's not something I've ever done before. I kind of just wanted to try it. It was a little bit tricky adding the silicone around the leaves, and some of the leaves did get stuck in the foam, but it wasn't too difficult. But it was kind of a little bit more challenging when setting up the enclosure, so keep in mind that you don't have to do that, and that's just something I was trying out, and it did make things a little bit more difficult for me. but if it's something that you'd like to try, you can go for it, but just be aware it's gonna be a little bit more difficult to do. So then it was time to start setting up the actual enclosure. So because this is a corn snake and it is going to be bioactive, it gets a little bit tricky because in order to have a bioactive substrate, the substrate typically needs to be very moist in order to sustain the springtails or isopods. And I can't have a very moist substrate for a corn snake because that can cause them to get sick. You don't want any respiratory infections or anything because they do require a low humidity level, and it would really increase the humidity level if you have a moist substrate. So it was a little bit tricky, and I'm going to explain exactly what I did to make sure that this would benefit the springtails and bioactive substrate as well as my snake. So the very first thing that I did was I added the Josh's Frogs bio bedding. I put a kind of thin layer on the bottom and I made sure that it was very, very moist. I sprayed it down and I made sure it was nice and clumpy the way that it's supposed to be, very moist substrate. So that was going to be perfect for adding these springtails, which I did next. I filled the container of springtails up with water and then I dumped that and the charcoal into the enclosure on top of the moist substrate. Then I sprayed the substrate again and mixed all of that in to make sure that these springtails were in an area that was moist, that was going to sustain them. And then after that, I took the plants and I made sure to rinse them off and try to root them as best as I could, getting all of the dirt and fertilizer off of them and making sure that it was just a root at the bottom. And then I took those plants and placed them within the enclosure where I wanted them to be. And then it was time to add the dry substrate. So I added a thick layer of dry substrate on top of all of the moist substrate just to make sure it would be safe for Bloom, my corn snake, because he can't have a moist substrate. So over time, when you do have a moist substrate like the Josh's Frogs bio bedding, I use it for Metamora, my green tree python, and Chancho, my blue tongue skink, and my pixie frog. And over time I noticed that the moisture always ends up going straight to the bottom of the substrate and then the top always dries out. So basically with Bloom, I was just trying to further the process of that happening because over time the moistness would go straight to the bottom and the top would dry out, especially with a heat lamp. So what I did was just I added everything, made it moist on the bottom and dry automatically on the top, so that way it would be safe for Bloom to go in. And over time it will stay that way and it will be safe for him. And the thing is with Bloom, every now and then I do have to spray his enclosure and up the humidity level because he does have a hard time shedding. So this will be great for the plants when I water them. It will also boost his humidity enough for him to be able to shed properly and not have any health issues. And it will also help the springtails as well. So if you are planning on going bioactive for a corn snake, I would highly recommend doing this process rather than just adding a moist substrate because you don't want it to be too humid for your corn snake. So after this whole process with the dirt and the plants, then I just added everything else that I needed into the enclosure, like the water bowl and the hides and everything. And then I topped everything off with leaf litter. And then I used the new heat lamp that Josh's Frog sent me and plugged it all in. It was looking great. And I checked the temperatures. The temperatures were perfect on his warm side and cool side, so everything was just going great. And then I added the snake clips, which I absolutely love. Like, they're so cheap. They're like $2 on Josh's Frogs, and they are a lifesaver. Like, I don't feel worried at all about Bloom escaping ever at this point because the snake clips are just perfect and they're so secure. So I highly recommend them if you have a snake in a tank because you don't want to lose your snake, obviously. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys the final product of the enclosure. I hope that you guys like it. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave it in a comment and I'll see you in the next one. So Bloom's enclosure is completely finished now. This is a 30-gallon enclosure, and once he gets bigger, I'm probably gonna have to upgrade it because it is very long, but it isn't very wide from the side at all. So I'm sure I'll end up upgrading, but for now, it's perfect for him and he has more than enough space in this enclosure. As you can see, I did make the substrate very moist at the bottom, so you can see that area where it's dark. That's all of the very moist substrate, and that's where all of the springtails are. And then I put a layer of dry substrate on top of that because corn snakes do need a dry environment. And over time with this substrate, the moisture usually goes to the bottom. So I basically just sped up the process and made sure it was moist on the bottom first and then put the dry substrate on top of it. Over time, I will have to spray down the enclosure just to water the plants, but that's not going to be a big deal whatsoever because I literally do that anyway. Every now and then I have to spray it down to increase the humidity to make sure that bloom has a proper shed. A lot of the times he would have really horrible sheds just because it was too dry for him and he wouldn't go and soak in his water bowl. So I think that this is going to work out perfectly for him and his plants. So a little overview, he has a plant over here. This is his warm hide. He's actually in there right now, but it's very dark, so you probably can't see anything. I just checked his temperature in there and it's perfect. So he is definitely happy in there. And normally he always is just in his cool hide. So now he's actually going in his warm hide, which is something that's completely new for him because before he had a heating pad and he literally never used it. And now he's choosing to go on the warm side because I think it's just heating the enclosure way better for him. So he's in the warm hide right now. He does have another little hide over here, this little T-Rex skull. He sometimes goes in there, but we'll see. And then his water bowl is right here. This is what he would always be under 24/7 because it also functions as a hide. So literally 100% of the time he was under that water bowl, and now obviously he went in the warm hide. He also has another option all the way over here. It's a tree, and this also functions as a cool hide for him as well. So I sprinkled everything with leaf litter on top of it and it's all just ready to go. And I think that he's enjoying it. He has way more space now and I think that his temperature is just going to be way better for him this way. I do love heating pads, but I honestly don't think it works great for snakes that aren't heavy bodied. So I think that this option is just working out so much better for him and it's just way more naturalistic and I love the way that it looks. So I'm just very happy with how this turned out.
Invincible.
And the last step is just putting the snake clips on. So they work really, really great. They completely hold it in place. I can't even lift that up at all.